What if I told you there's a law school change coming in 2026 that flips the whole system on its head, and most applicants still have no idea it's even happening? And this is not the rankings or some new law school admissions trend. I'm talking about the thing that controls everything else: how law school gets paid for. Because starting this year in July, the federal government is putting hard limits on how much students can borrow for graduate school. And if you understand what that truly means, you're going to see something that most people miss. This is not some small policy tweak, it's an entire market reset. It changes who can afford law school, how schools set tuition, how scholarships work, which schools struggle, and how risky the entire mindset of just borrow it becomes. So today I'm going to break down what's actually changing in 2026, why it matters more than almost any admissions advice that you're hearing, who gets hurt, who benefits, and which schools are most exposed. I'm also going to share how to think about your law school plan like an adult with a calculator, not a consumer getting sold a dream. Now, for years, law school financing was brutally simple. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. The school posts a cost of attendance that can be wildly high, and students cover it with federal loans. Historically, the logic went like this: you borrow some standard federal government loans, and then if there's still a gap, you fill the rest with Grad Plus loans. And Grad Plus basically allowed you to borrow up to the cost of attendance, meaning the school says law school costs X, and the system says to you, okay, here's X. And when that's the environment, tuition behaves in a very predictable way. Not based on what education should cost, but based on what schools believe students can pay, which for a long time effectively meant whatever the federal government would finance. And that's how you get to the modern reality where a student can look at the total cost of attendance that's the size of a mortgage and still feel like, well, that's just what law school costs because the money's been there and it's been too easy to get it. And when borrowing's easy, people stop asking whether it's worth it, financially worth it. Not like you've always wanted to be a lawyer and your parents are proud of you, but whether it's actually worth the return on the investment that you're getting. Now, starting later this year, the rules change in two major ways. First, Grad Plus goes away for new borrowers, and secondly, there are now hard caps on federal borrowing for grad school and other professional programs. So here is the simplest way to see it. If you're going to law school and your total annual cost is higher than the federal cap, there's a gap. And the government is no longer automatically filling that gap with unlimited Grad Plus borrowing. So instead of the school setting the price and you borrow it, we shift to the government sets the max and the school has to justify the rest. And that one change forces a harsh reality into the conversation, because the numbers that floating around that matter most for law school are these. For professional programs like law school, the federal annual cap is $50,000 per year, with a $200,000 lifetime cap for professional borrowing. The takeaway is law school counts as a professional program and that cap is real. And so if your law school's cost of attendance is, say, $85,000 a year, and the federal max is $50,000, you've got a $35,000 shortfall or gap every single year. And across 3 years, that's $250,000. And this changes everything because when you cap borrowing, you change behavior, you change incentives, you change who can say yes. So first, tuition becomes real. Prior to the change, schools could post a high sticker price and still fill the seats because students could just finance it. But when that cap hits, students start doing math, and law schools hate when you do math because then you're actually measuring whether it's worth it. So schools then get forced into making one of three moves. They can cut the price, they can increase scholarships, or they can accept smaller classes. And there are problems with each one of those options. And if they can't do any of those, the schools themselves get put into a pretty shaky position. Then the scholarships become less about merit and more about closing that gap between the cost of attendance and what you can borrow. Now, scholarships aren't just generosity on the parts of law schools, they're a pricing strategy that are used to shape medians for US news rankings. And when borrowing's capped, scholarships start getting used for a new purpose of making the program financeable so you can actually afford it. In other words, even schools that never wanted a discount much might be forced to. Because if enough students say they can't make it work, the school has a real problem. And then outcomes and return on investment start dominating the conversation. When it was easy to borrow, schools could say, we've got a beautiful campus, we have clinics, we're in a great city, you're going to have a great network, and all of that's cool. But when the money starts to get tighter, applicants start asking tougher questions like, what percentage of graduates get JD required jobs? Or what are the typical outcomes for the majority of the class, not just the top 10%? What are the bar passage rates? Are the scholarships conditional? How many people lose them? And that's why the American Bar Association 509 reports and employment outcome data matter so much, because applicants are going to start reading the fine print. Now, many people hear loan caps and immediately assume it's going to hurt only lower income students. Now, the students who got crushed hardest under the old system were the ones who didn't have lawyers in the family, didn't have financial guidance, didn't understand how to evaluate law school outcomes, and they were the most likely to trust the law school's marketing. But now, loan caps are functioning more like a blunt form of consumer protection because they force that question earlier of, will this realistically pay off for you as the student, as the consumer? Because when the federal lending stops covering everything, you've got to dig into your savings, go for private loans, work while you're in school, or rely on family. And of course, private loans are not a great substitute, which means you've got to deal with real credit checks. You've got to deal with a cosigner, worse rates, higher interest, fewer protections, and less flexibility if your income isn't what you hoped it would be right away. And private lenders are pricing in risk. And so if a school has weak outcomes, a lender might decide, we don't like this bet, or they're going to offer terms that are brutal. And so yes, some students are going to use private loans, but they are not a clean replacement for unlimited federal Grad Plus borrowing. And the moment law school requires private underwriting to attend, the entire population that can attend law school is going to shift. And that is a real structural change. Now let's talk about the students that feel this first and hardest because of the math. The most exposed schools tend to be the high-cost programs with limited institutional money, the schools with weaker employment outcomes, schools that relied on filling seats at high sticker prices, and schools where many students already borrow close to the full cost of attendance. Because when the borrowing is capped, net tuition revenue drops, enrollment drops. And once that happens, everything gets harder. And once a school's numbers start sliding, you get a ripple effect, a domino effect, a cascade with smaller class sizes, tighter budgets, fewer resources, weaker employment outcomes, and lower bar passage support. This is not going to happen overnight, of course. It's more of a slow squeeze. And so some schools will shrink, some will merge, some will close down. It's just basic economics. Now, here's the trap I want you to avoid as a student. A lot of applicants are going to respond to all of this with one of two extremes. One extreme is law school is over, it's impossible, it's broken, it's done for. The second extreme is none of this applies to me personally, I'm going to figure this out later. But that's also not a plan. The right response to these changes is calmer and sharper. You've got to treat law school like a financial investment with uncertainty. It's an investment, and you got to look at whether the return is going to be worth it based on the cost that you're paying. So when you're looking at a school in the new era, I want you to look at 5 big questions and write them down with numbers associated. First question is, what is the total annual cost of attendance? Not tuition alone, but also factor in fees and living expenses. Schools love to spotlight the tuition and hide everything else. You don't want to fall for that. The second big question is, what is the realistic federal borrowing cap for my situation? If the cap is below your annual cost of attendance, you have a gap, so name it. Third question is, how will you cover the gap? And you want to be specific here. Is it savings? Is it family support? Is it work income? Is it scholarships? Is it private loans? And if the answer is, I don't know, that's a red flag. You've got to be able to answer that question. The fourth question is, what are the typical outcomes for students at this school? Not the superstar outcomes, but the typical ones. And this is where the ABA 509 reports come in handy. You got to look at employment outcomes, JD required roles, bar passage rates. And the fifth question is, what happens if I don't get the outcome I'm imagining? So if you graduate and you're not making the salary you were hoping for, what happens to your finances? Can you still pay your rent? Can you still afford to live? Can you still move? And the answer is, I'd be stuck. That's going to matter also. So here's what I expect you're going to see as this shift hits in real time starting this fall. You're going to see more guaranteed scholarships and tuition offset programs as schools try to bring tuition closer to what you can finance. You're going to see more aggressive scholarship negotiation and competition. You're going to see more scrutiny on conditional scholarships as applicants get smarter. You're going to see a bigger split between schools with strong outcomes and schools with weak outcomes. And you're going to see more applicants optimizing for debt to income ratios, not just prestige. So bottom line, law school changes this year because the financing model changes. When federal borrowing gets capped and Grad Plus loans aren't there to automatically fill the gap for new borrowers, the entire system has to adjust. Schools will adjust their pricing, they'll also adjust their scholarships, and the risk will be harder for applicants to ignore. And the applicants who do the best in this new era are not the ones who have the most anxiety. They're the ones who can do three things. They get the best LSAT scores they can to create options and leverage. They evaluate schools using outcomes and costs. And they build a plan that works even if life goes a little bit off script. That's how you win in 2026, with clarity and with numbers, with the data, doing the homework.